Isn't it interesting as we commit to reading systematically through the scriptures, our Old Testament readings and our New Testament readings, that as we read through them systematically, oftentimes we come to a day like today, where on the one hand, last week we read in Exodus 14 what God did in the midst of the Red Sea. This week we read about the celebration of what God did in the midst of the Red Sea. Then 3 days later they're grumbling and complaining. And then we read in Revelation 9 about God's judgment. Again, we see that consistent picture of the God who judges sin. Just as we commit to reading systematically through the New Testament and through the Old Testament. And again, as we commit to preaching systematically through the scriptures, and now find ourselves still in the beginning of this journey through Genesis chapters 1 through 11, looking at it from an apologetics perspective. And by that, again, we don't mean that we are apologizing for anything. Amen? But apologetics comes from 1 Peter chapter 3. Again, Peter says that we're always to be ready to give an answer for the hope that is within us. And that word there, reasoned response or answer, is the Greek word apologia. And it's from that word that we get our word apologetics. And Genesis 1 through 11 deals with frontline issues in our culture today. We've looked at the origin and the nature of man. We've looked at man and his relationship to the earth. In dealing with these issues of radical environmentalism, now we are looking at the issue of man and his relationship to woman, and this picture of marriage and God's design for men and for women and for marriage. And we are once again on the front lines. This is a battlefield in our culture. Marriage has fallen into disarray and has fallen out of favor in our culture. Listen to this from Alexis de Tocqueville. In 1851, he said, "There is certainly no country in the world where the tie of marriage is more respected than in America, or where conjugal happiness is more highly or worthily appreciated." No country in the world, he says, there in 1851. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Amen? We don't look at marriage that way anymore. Just 69 years later, in 1920, listen to these words from Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood. She says, "Only in recent years has woman's position as the gentler and weaker half of the human family been emphatically and generally questioned. Men assumed that this was woman's place. Woman herself accepted it. It seldom occurred to anyone to ask whether she would go on occupying it forever. Accepting her role as the, quote, weaker and gentler half, she accepted that function. In turn, the acceptance of that function fixed the more firmly her rank as an inferior. Caught in this vicious circle, woman has, through her reproductive ability, founded and perpetuated the tyrannies of the earth. Whether it was the tyranny of monarchy, an oligarchy, or a republic, the one indispensable factor of its existence was, as it is now, hordes of human beings. Human beings so plentiful as to be cheap, and so cheap that ignorance was their natural lot. Upon the rock of an unenlightened, submissive maternity have these been founded, and upon the product of such a maternity have they been flourishing." In other words, according to Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, the root and the cause of all of the tyrannies of the earth is women accepting the role of the weaker sex, of women going along gleefully with this concept of reproduction. And because of women gleefully participating in this hideous prospect of bringing forth hordes of human beings, all of the tyrannies of the world have been perpetuated. Just 69 years. after de Tocqueville made his comments about marriage in this culture. We live in a time, we live in a day, we live in a culture where marriage is under attack. More specifically, where male headship in marriage is under attack. We hear it all the time, do we not? But why is this so important? And what about the church? Listen to this from Daniel Doriani in Biblical Foundations for Manhood and Womanhood, a book that we have in the back, by the way. He says, for over 18 centuries, the church was confident that it understood biblical texts central to the Christian concept of marriage and gender relations. The church's leading pastors, theologians, and exegetes held that Ephesians 5, for example, taught mutuality and service within the structure given by the leadership of a husband and father. The church judged Ephesians 5 and other passages, such as Genesis 2, where we are today, and 1 Timothy 2, which we'll allude to today, difficult to perform, perhaps, but not difficult to understand. For 18 centuries, the church didn't consider Genesis 2 or Ephesians 5 or 1 Timothy 2 or 1 Corinthians chapter 11, for that matter, difficult to understand. Difficult to perform, perhaps, but not at all difficult to understand. They're straightforward. They teach male headship in marriage. However, a handful of Christians began to question this consensus in the 1800s. But the onslaught began with the onset of feminism a few decades ago. As it often does, the church started to echo a new cultural movement by adopting the questions and sensibilities of feminism about a decade after its arrival. Theologians then began to read teachings about submission and leadership in new ways. Not surprisingly, feminist interpretations of Ephesians 5 started to appear in commentaries around 1970. That's most of our lifetimes. This shift has occurred. This monumental shift in our understanding of the biblical roles of men and women has occurred in the lifetime of most of us here in this room, as it relates to the church and the way that the church views these issues. Now, many of us look out and we're aghast as we see, for example, churches performing homosexual marriages. Churches like the Episcopalian Church appointing homosexual bishops just a few years ago. And again, we're aghast at this. But I want you to understand something. Don't miss this point. There was a very short leap from this occurrence in 1970, questioning what the scriptures have to say about marriage and the roles of men and women in marriage, to where we find ourselves now, where we're questioning whether the marriage is between a man and a woman. It's a very short leap. It's a slippery slope. When you give up on the basic fundamental principles found in the text, you have made an exegetical choice. And by that I mean, we've made a choice in the way we interpret the scriptures. And if I make a choice in the way that I interpret the scriptures based upon trends that I see in the culture, then all of a sudden, all of the implications of my interpretation will eventually be played out in every aspect of life. And that is where we are today. Because if male headship isn't what we clearly see in the text, then we've employed a new hermeneutic. And based on that new hermeneutic, or art and science of interpretation, the next thing to fall is male headship in the church. That fell so long ago that now most of us don't even cringe when we see female pastors. We just assume that it's appropriate for women to serve as pastors in churches, or teachers of men in Sunday school classes, or leaders in their home because their husbands are weak or impotent or absent. We just assume that it's okay for men to be dominated by their wives. Why? Because once we give up on the foundational, fundamental principle, where will we stop?